Hey folks, Pat Higgins here and welcome back to Rewriting Chainsaw Fairytale, my irregular series of vlogs about a script that I wrote after a period of sleep deprivation that I had no recollection of writing, and this is going to chart my progress in terms of taking that weird 105-page almost stream of consciousness script and actually turning it into a viable, structured, either sellable or producible screenplay. So, okay, last time on this I told you the whole story of how the script came about, and now I'm going to talk you through what I've been doing with it this week in order to try and tackle, first up, what's wrong with it, and secondly, to try and structure it a little bit so that hopefully it will one day see people's home entertainment systems, or even, dare I say it, cinema screens. So, okay, I'm really going to be looking a lot at the first scene today, but what I'm also going to do is set up a structure for how I'm going to be tackling the entire thing. Now, the structure that I'm using is partially been inspired by, I've been experimenting with bullet journaling, which you may have come across other vloggers and various kind of lifestyle gurus and whatnot talking about. The idea of bullet journaling in a very basic way is to get a tangible notebook rather than apps and whatnot that are all full of to-do lists. Get a tangible notebook with a series of bullet points within it so that you can cross things off, and it's a way of organising your kind of to-do schedule. Now, I've started bullet journaling just in general in my life as a way of trying to organise stuff. I've previously used all kinds of apps, Evernote, Workflowy, stuff like that, with some degree of success, but I've found that actually having a tangible notebook that I can cross things off in, very old school, and it kind of works for me. Now, some people have got, including the founder of bullet journaling, have got very distinct systems for how bullet journaling could potentially work. What I've done is grabbed a few of those ideas and applied them to the way that I structure my rewriting. So the first thing that I did this week was, as I say, this is my regular bullet journal. This is what I use to actually organise my life. What I did was I hit a pound shop, and I found that you can get these little notebooks are 2 for £1. So I splashed out a few quid and got a whole bunch of these little notebooks. I've then allocated one of these little notebooks to each project. And this one here is my Chainsaw Fairytale one. So how this would be of any use to the rewriting, hopefully that will become clear. What I'm operating by here is the theory that every screenplay or every movie has 40, I'm going to use the term scenes. Normally a screenplay would have significantly more than 40 scenes. You're probably more around the 100 mark, but for 40 scenes, what I'm really talking about is 40 bits of business, 40 things that need to happen. And so for the sake of argument, I'm going to call those scenes. Each one of those scenes may actually have 2, maybe even 3 scenes within it, but they all make one bit of business. So the first thing that I've done in my little kind of bullet plan thing here is I've set out pages for each of those 40 scenes. So I've gone through and I had the fun of actually going through, you probably can't even read that, going through and actually marking out 40 times. I did it 40 times, so although a lot of these are blank at the moment, so I'm not going through in chronological order. I've got a marked a double page out for 40 scenes for Chainsaw Fairytale. What I've then done is I've started making notes on each of those scenes and how it works. Now, in order to kind of look at how it's working as a scene, I've used as a jumping off point, there's a list of points for a scene that John August put up on his website. There's a load of excellent resources on John August's website, thoroughly recommend it. He put a series of bullet points of things to consider for each scene within your screenplay. Now, I've adapted a few of those, but the first one that I've got at the head of each of these, hang on, there you go, is what needs to happen. Oh, Not what's going to happen, not what should happen, what needs to happen. So this is the reason that the actual scene exists. So in the case of my first scene, of Chainsaw Fairytale, now quite a lot of Chainsaw Fairytale, as I said, comes out as a kind of stream of consciousness. It's not entirely well considered, but the beginning seems to be slightly more coherent than some of the later stuff. Whether this was because I wasn't quite so sleep deprived when I wrote it, or whether it's because I went back and did some rewrites, I don't know. I can't remember. But either way, the opening is in reasonably good shape. But that's even a better example for something that I can then nail down and work out exactly what needs to happen within that scene. So basically speaking, our opening scene for Chainsaw Fairytale sets up our, for want of a better word, horror universe. We open as if we're in a slasher movie. And the characters, two specific characters from this, then end up getting teleported through to a different dimension or a different reality, which is our fairy tale reality. So again, if you missed the first one, the whole pitch of this is that basically you get characters from a splatter movie universe entering into a fairy tale environment, and that fairy tale environment gradually begins to obey the laws of a splatter movie rather than a fairy tale. So we start off with an opening scene that just sets us up in Splatsville. There's a couple of reasons why this is actually quite a good idea, and again, I'm not even taking credit for it because I don't remember writing it. But particularly when you're dealing with genre stuff, you may have noticed with horror movies they quite often start with a flash forward. This is to actually establish tone and to establish genre, without having to go through all the legwork of the setup sequence. Because obviously the first sort of 10-15 minutes of your movie are actually going to be setting up characters, setting up their environments, establishing what the world is like before all the nightmarish stuff comes and knocks that over. But if someone sits down and watches a horror movie about, say, a librarian fighting against an evil demon, they don't want to have 15 minutes of just librarian setup before you get some demony stuff, because they'll be thinking, what kind of a movie am I watching here? Is this a horror movie? So in order to establish genre, quite a lot of horror movies have a flash forward. They flash forward to something that happens later, in terms of blood up the walls, or alternatively they have a flashback to the previous time this happened. So if you're going to be dealing with an escaped maniac, you might start in the middle of his previous rampage so that you can go, yes, this is a horror movie, don't worry, blood up the walls is coming, and then you move into the whole setup thing where you actually make a character that people care about. Now in the case of Chainsaw Fairytale, having a splattery, gore-soaked sequence right at the beginning of it makes sense, because once we've gone through into the fairy tale land, at least initially, the fairy tale land obeys the laws of fairy tales. If you start in the fairy tale land, you're effectively not going to get any gore, any violence for at least the first act of the movie, probably a little bit more. And if anybody's turned onto it thinking this was a horror movie, or at least a horror comedy or a horror fantasy, whatever you want to call it, they're going to be thinking this just feels like a Disney flick at the moment, because it will have the imagery of one and nobody will get hurt, because that's the premise. So starting with gore-soaked, blood up the walls, slam bang opening makes perfect sense from a genre point of view, so I'm keeping that. Now my opening needs to establish a few characters. It needs to establish the killer, who is called Melvin, who is an enormous, great murderous Hulk. More of the kind of Jason school of killers than the Hannibal Lecter, put it that way. It needs to establish Amy, who is our protagonist. And it also establishes another important character. Well, I say important, she's thematically important, but she's not actually a character that we follow particularly, which is Vicky. Now, because we're dropping into a slasher movie setup, what would be the end scene if we were watching a slasher movie, we have our killer and we have these two girls. And what needs to be established within this opening scene is that Amy, who is our character who will be going through into the fairy tale world, would not normally be the final girl. Now, Amy doesn't realise this, because obviously that's something that clued up audience members will pull out of it from what they know about genre, but the character is not going to be aware of these kind of things. She's just a a girl trying to survive in a horrible environment. But so my opening scene needs to establish, hang on, what are the notes that I've actually got down here? So my notes for it are that my scene needs to establish the slasher world and at least the rules and the vibe of that slasher world. We need to introduce Melvin, Vicky and Amy. We need to establish what point their slasher world is at the time they leave it, because that's where they're going to resume from, and that's going to be important later in the script. And we need to establish the portal itself that kind of sends them through. All of those bullet points, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could do that within a scene. Now, as I say, going back to John August's list of things that you want to establish within every scene, who needs to be there is another really important question. This is something that I will break down for every scene that I kind of go through, because I am very guilty sometimes of having characters in scenes who don't have anything to do. If you've got a character in a scene and they haven't got anything to do, you get them the hell out of there. There's no reason for them to be there. Don't have them hanging around in the background. Sometimes you don't even notice that till you go on set. You'll end up on set and there'll be an actor going, what am I actually meant to be doing here? And you're thinking, oh Christ, well, you've got a line at the beginning of the scene and then I kind of didn't write anything for you to do after that. So you need to make sure that the only people who are there are people who need to be there in order to further the plot. John August also suggests that you think about the locations. Now, in my random draft, this takes place in the kitchen of something that I've just described as a deadly house or a murderous house or something like that. It doesn't have to be in the kitchen. So I brainstormed, it could be in a school, it could be in a college, a house, a graveyard, a shed. It could be a prom, because the prom gets kind of referenced a few times, but it all depends on budget and it all depends on those sorts of things. John August suggests that you check whether a scene needs to be long or short. This is relatively long because it's got quite a lot of legwork to do, but I still need to keep it as short and punchy as possible. He suggests thinking of 3 different ways to start every scene, so I kind of went through that and I thought, okay, in the script, the opening line is actually close up on the eye of a severed head. Hey, I never said I was subtle. It could start with that way. It could start with a mouth screaming. It could start with something that's more of a fairy tale image before it crashes into the horror imagery. Now, in my random draft, it actually says, before the close-up on the eye of the severed head, it says, opulent Disney-style opening title on purple velvet, accompanied by sweeping orchestral music, slam cuts to, bang, close-up on the eye of the severed head. So that established the fairy tale and chainsaw elements together like that. There could be a different way of doing that. I could do it, I thought about where I said about locating to prom. The advantage of that was that you could potentially have some imagery in terms of dresses, in terms of lighting, in terms of whatever, that makes it feel like more of a fairy tale thing before the gore kicks in. Because although we want this gore scene up the front of it, again, we're stuck with this thing of establishing genre, establishing tone. We don't want it to just feel like it's a straight slasher movie any more than we want it to feel like it's a straight fairy tale. So the way that I actually go into the scene matters. In my bullet plan, as I've been calling it in here, I've also been marking out on every one of these 40 scenes that I've marked out what beat I am on, and I've used Blake Snyder's beat sheet from Save the Cat. I know a lot of people have huge problems with the way that Blake Snyder sets out beats, but for me it's the one that I'm very, very familiar with, and so it's the one that I just think of off the top of my head. So I realise the arguments for and against beat sheets in general, and specifically the Save the Cat beat sheet. However, for me, just so that I have a map of where I should be roughly in the movie, it makes sense. So on my opening pages in my little booklet, I've set out what needs to happen in the scene, who needs to be in the scene, where the scene could take place. I've then decided that this needs to be a long scene but still needs to be brief enough that we can get to where we need to go to without the audience settling into it too much. I've considered 3 different ways to start it, and I've identified, it's always key to note that every scene needs some element of conflict in it. Now, the conflict here is fairly in your face. This is a physical conflict between a slasher monster and a final girl and another slasher girl. So the conflict's fairly in your face, but I have a little part here where I note, all right, is there conflict here? Because it's very important that every scene needs to have some kind of conflict in it. If it's a scene of exposition, if it's a scene where someone is just explaining what's going to happen, well, this is going to be this, and this is going to be this, and this is going to be this, you still need to build in some conflict, some element that's going to make it more difficult for them to relay that information. And then finally on here, I've listed what beat it refers to in terms of Blake Snyder's beat sheet. If you haven't come across that before, if you go to savethecat.com, you can see various different variations of it there, or the book Save the Cat obviously has it as well. This beat is the opening image, and the point of the opening image is to relay to the audience as much information as possible about the tone and the genre and whatnot of the movie they're about to watch. So I've started working on this. I'm going to continue working on it in this little notebook where I'm going to break down my 40 scenes for the entire written screenplay and go through this process for each one, working out who needs to be there and all those sorts of things, and working out whether all of those 40 things have to exist, whether they've got the right people in them, whether they're taking place in the right places, whether they've all got conflict, whether they take place at the right point in the narrative. And I'm going to pad out all of those in my little book, my little bullet plan, and then I'll be able to take a step back and go, all right, where do we go from here? And that's where I go to next time I'll talk to you guys. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Subscribe. I don't know if I'll set up a thing saying subscribe, but come subscribe. Head over to, as I say, I'm trying to build up a little screenwriting community, which I'll put the little URL for here. And cheers for listening, and I'll see you next time.